coming. My name is Jake Warren. I'm the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Partnership. So that you know kind of ahead of time, I tell people this all the time, I'm a super nervous speaker, so if I completely screw this up, forgive me. Having said that, so today's kind of event of having the Assistant Secretary here and kind of gathering everyone here, you know, we're doing this in partnership with the City Commission on Human Relations, because the way that I see this is we all have work to do. Right? All of us, in one way or another, touch the communities that we are here to help, and we help them by providing the housing, but we do that in a way, we want to make sure that that's done in a way that gives them the optimum choice of fair housing. Having said that, I want to start and give kind of the commission themselves a shout out, because they were our partners in this, and to be clear, they're also the partners with HUD as a Fair Housing Assistance Program, as a FAP, and one day I'll explain all the acronyms of fair housing to you. But they work with us really to ensure that we're able to fight on behalf of the victims of discrimination along with our HUD partners. And in particular, I'm going to give I told her ahead of time, but Megan Stanley, who's the acting executive director, really helped put all the logistics and make this happen. And so I believe in giving people credit for the work that they do. And so she has done a wonderful job, and she's also been a good partner of ours at FHP. So I want to take a second just to make sure people understand that she has worked hard, and she recognizes that we have work to do. Having said that, 10 seconds on FHP, and then I will get to my intro of the Assistant Secretary, and then I will get out of everyone's hair. So if you don't know, the Fair Housing Partnership, we've been doing this work of fair housing enforcement for 30 years now, actually since 1984. And the work that we do, we recognize our role is to ensure that everyone has equal access to housing, that everyone can get housing that is free from discrimination, and then when that doesn't happen, that we are the ones who are going to step in and help them out and enforce that law. Now, what does that mean for us, right? It means that when we talk about the work to do, we talk about when a family contacts us and says, I'm being thrown out of my house because I found out that I'm pregnant, and they've told me that they won't allow me with this extra occupant, as they're calling it, and so I have to find a new place to live. What do I do? And so we step in and say, wait a second, that's a violation of the Fair Housing Act. We work with our partners at HUD, and we work with our partners at the Commission, and we make sure that those people are not evicted and that they're found, that they're able to keep their housing and get access to housing, because we have real work to do. It looks like when someone contacts us and they tell us that they won't be rented a house, or in fact they'll be charged more because they are black. And during an actual investigation that was sent to HUD and then sent to our partners, that they refer to a man who is in his mid-30s as this black boy, we recognize that to stop that behavior, right, our job is to step in with our partners because we have work to do. We understand that the work that we do is when a group of disabled residents who are living in housing right now, who are being told that they need to move not once, but twice, who are elderly, who don't understand what's happening, who may not actually be able to make those moves multiple times, that we step in, we talk with our partners at HUD, and we talk with our partners at the Commission, and we make the changes that are necessary because we have work to do. So FHP, in our space in the kind of fair housing world, is to work with our partners to help out the individuals who are facing what is real discrimination, because it still continues in our city. We've seen it time and time again. And so we're going to step in because we have work to do. And to be honest, that means even looking at a larger level, a systemic level, when we talk about how we develop the city. All of us are connected to housing in one way or another. And we know that our city is changing. We know how it's changing. We see the high-income earners of Google and Facebook. We see the transformation. We need to make sure as this change goes on that it includes a fair opportunity for all of our citizens, regardless of any protected class, because again, we have real work to do. Now, having said that, I want to tell you a little bit about kind of the assistant secretary from my lens, right? So you got to understand, I go to a conference in November, and most of you who know me know that my kind of space is I want to get something done. If we got an issue, we got an issue. I'll say it to your face, right? I'm the kind of person that believes like, hey, and she heard this before. I'll come to this in a second, but you know, you got a problem with me? You want to dance with me? I'm right here, right? And some of you I've danced with, right? We know this. But the reality is, right, that this idea of getting things done, right, that's where I come from. So I go to HUD, there's a HUD conference, and a regional director, Melody, had asked if I can be on a panel. Thank you very much, I appreciate that. And during that, one of the things that I always try to do on a panel is I want to like make a statement about something that we can do, right? Like, why don't we do this? And so I knew the assistant secretary was there. And I thought to myself, you know what, I'm going to make this call out, because the work that we do, we have complaints, we file complaints, but so many times we can help people if we didn't have to go through the complaint process, and we have these obligations. I'm going to make this call out because I know she's there, and maybe she'll hear what I'm saying, right? And so I'm sitting on this panel, and I'm like, you know, hey, you know, our organizations, if we cannot file complaints and we can get it done, you know, HUD should let us count these things, and they should give us credit for doing good work. And I figure I'm going to say this, right, and it'll fall on deaf ears, and she'll walk out, and, you know, that'll be that. And from the audience, right, I hear, yeah, you go ahead and do that. I'm like, who said that, right? And sure enough, it's the assistant secretary. And what mattered so much about that was this was a moment that, as what's called a FIP, as an advocacy agency, I'm making a call for someone to help me do my work. And she could have just let that go by. I have been at enough assistant secretaries, to be honest, you know, that I could have, I say it, everybody goes home, and it's done. But that's not the kind of woman that she is. She's the kind of woman that gets things done. And that's my big takeaway. Now, I'll tell you the other thing about it. So that happens, right? And I'm feeling on top of the world. Because right now, Assistant Secretary, if you don't know, the rest of the FIPs all come up to me like, yeah, you're the man. Way to get that done, right? And so this happens, and then we go, and she's keynoting for, this is every agency like mine across the country. And so we're standing there, and we're sitting there, rather, and I'm listening to her, and all of a sudden, I hear her mention my name. I said, what? But what she's mentioning my name about is the comment of, do you want to dance with me? Right? Why? Because there's certain kind of people in the world. And they're the kind of people in the world who want to get it done, and they're the kind of people in the world that just want to talk about it. And she's one of the kind of people that want to get it done. Now, I'll tell you my last kind of little piece on this. I don't really do like the bio reading thing. My apologies. It is not my best space. So what I'm going to say is this. When I talk about the assistant secretary in terms of getting things done, we're talking about somebody who has run a housing authority, who's lived in the housing authority, who has been there firsthand, who knows what the challenges are that we all face. That means it's somebody who knows how to get it done. It also, you should recognize, this is not her first rodeo. She has been at HUD, retired out, came back to help us out, and I cannot tell you how much we appreciate it, because I know what it looks like when I have partners who support me, and I know what it looks like when I have partners who don't support me. And what we have is a partner who supports us. I have two last things that I promise I'm done. The first is, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that from my vantage point, HUD wanted this to happen, right? Like, their concern of Pittsburgh is why this happens. They reach out, they came out here, they're the ones who are sitting here listening to me give my mediocre speech. And so I just want to give recognition not only to the assistant secretary, but to Lindy Allen, her assistant, to Melody Taylor, who is the one who put me on the panel, our regional director, to Barbara Delaney, who's out of Philly. I appreciate all of you, and I hope that you know that. And then the very, 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 very last thing that I will say, okay, and then I'm out of this. If you don't know, right, The agencies that do this work, from the commissions to the FIP agencies to HUD, if you don't understand what we do, we enforce the Fair Housing Act. There are two ways I want people to look at us. I want them to love us because we are here to help you. And I want you to fear us if you want to break the Fair Housing Act. So for those of you who are on the right side, which I assume everybody in this room is, right? Welcome. For the rest of you who want to do something that isn't within the law, you really want to dance with us? All right, with that, I give you the Assistant Secretary.
I'm very glad to be here. And when Jay invited me during the conference, I immediately said yes. And there was a reason for it. Melody, the regional director for Region 3, had invited him to be on a panel, and he was the last speaker. And of course, everyone took longer, and he was the one between lunch and the rest. And I'm like, he's gonna lose the audience. So by the time it got to him, he only had 10 minutes. But he might have been nervous, but he spoke so fast, and he got all his points. And afterwards, as people were walking towards lunch, because they were not about to miss lunch, including yours truly, I heard people saying, I wish he had been the first speaker so he could have taken more time, because I really picked up so much during those 10 minutes. So even though he only had 10 minutes, it was a loaded 10 minutes. And the second reason I said yes was, this is my second official visit to Pittsburgh. The very first one was in 1981, when I was just 1 year out of law school and I was a puppy attorney working in Washington for the Merit Systems Protection Board, which does federal personnel law. And during that time, I was the last lawyer that had been hired. And like now, in the past also, there were a lot of budget cuts. So the agency did not have the luxury to send a little puppy attorney to learn how to argue a case with a senior attorney. And this was supposed to be a very simple case. It was a violation of a Hatch Act. It was very simple. You run for office, it was bipartisan. You're not supposed to do that when you're a federal employee. Worse for this person, they lost the election, so then the special counsel went after that person. They said, this is a very simple case, go and do it yourself. And so the very first case that I argued was here in Pittsburgh. And I remember now, they sent me to the hotel. The hotel was the size of a broom closet. Apparently I got the last room, and it was right by Willie Penn, something or other. So they wanted me to the hotel next to the HUD offices. So I get there and I thought, oh God, if this is what government travel is all about. I ordered breakfast and I had to get out of the room so service could come in. But anyway, I get to the courthouse, and then I also realized why lawyers wear either blue, black, or gray suits. And that is, as you're shaking and there's sweat going down your back, people cannot see it. That is the reason why lawyers wear dark colors, to look so somber. And part of the reason they look so somber is you're so scared and your knees are shaking. Anyway, we won the case. It was a summary judgment. It was a simple case. The lawyer, even the judge twice had to go because I was repeating what the defendant's lawyer had been saying, and it was like, oh Lord, they send me the young ones that don't know anything. And unfortunately, I had to do something terrible, which was repeat all the wonderful things they had said about the woman. And then I said, so, when you had a choice to make, which was get federal money or lose your employee, you chose to get the money and lose this wonderful employee. And that's all I said. I said, thank you, no more questions. And I looked, and the lawyer was just like, and the poor woman was just devastated. So yes, I did. The judge, by the way, had a big grin like, all right, kid. So you did know which direction you were going. So I got my summary judgment. So that was my wonderful experience with Pittsburgh, and I figured, stop while you're ahead. So anyway, Jay, I do want to thank you. And I do want to thank you very much for being one of the most and fastest HUD FIPS. When I came back, I had spent some time at HUD, 8 years at HUD, and I remember, oh, that's right, Office of Fair Housing has the FIPS, the FAPS, the this, the that, the REDS, the what, you know, it's like, I thought I never had to worry about one more federal acronym. But there's a reason why it's important. Secretary Carson also says partnerships are the most important things. And I tell our office, yes, we are the Office of Enforcement, but if we work by ourselves, we will not get anywhere. We will spend a lot of times doing depositions and in court, but when you spend time working with each other, then we can at least achieve 50%. Unless what you're doing is all wrong, then we cannot go that way. And that's also what I tell our staff. Don't just say my way or the highway, because then you give us a bad name. To the extent that we can negotiate, that's exactly what it's called, a negotiation. It's a give and take. And I can assure you that one of the hardest working person about give and take is Miss Melody, is the regional director. When I first arrived at HUD, they said, oh, you should have seen her when she was negotiating with Baltimore to do all those thousands of affordable homes. And the politicians were getting so angry. They were just starting to walk out of the room and says, no, sir, now, let's just calm down. Let's just calm down. And I thought, oh, that's bad news when Melody starts telling you, just calm down. Just brought him back. Brought him back to the room about 5, 6 times. And at the end of the 2 days, she got what she had come for. More support and more protection and more affordable housing for the people that need it. But she was very calm about it, and that's what you want. Now, today's conference about fair housing began in the South. I'm a kid from Crystal City, Texas, from the South, and I remember reading about it when I was small. And civil rights really began in the South, which was Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi. But you here in the East Coast also had your civil rights movement. And this is where the Pittsburgh freedom fighters, also called the torchbearers, conducted marches that led to the desegregation of public schools, city pools, and other public accommodations. When I grew up, I went to a school that was completely segregated. It was a one schoolroom for all what they would refer to as the Mexican school. And it was separated as if you were a migrant kid, even though I was not a migrant. But if you didn't speak the language, you went to that classroom made of wood, and it was dirt. The floor was dirt. And it was no different than the place that LBJ, who is responsible for the Civil Rights, Voting Act, and fair housing, he taught school 18 miles from where I grew up in Cotulla, Texas. And he taught school to all those little Mexican kids in the Mexican school that no one wanted to teach because they didn't think they needed to be educated. And maybe for some people that was right. Look what happens to someone like me once you educate me. You want to dance? We're going to dance. And you better know the tango because I know how to dance. So, and it's these heroic actions that take place day in and day out. And oftentimes, we don't even know who's responsible. Sometimes we do, other times people don't need the credit. They just want to know that every single day they have tried to help someone do something right. Either because they said they were going to do that when they were running for office, so you make them fulfill their promise, or they prove them wrong, and therefore then you make them into cynics and liars. And I refer to this as a win-win situation. You out them out. Back in Texas, we've referred to them smoke them out. People need to know who they are. Yesterday we came in, luckily because of the bad weather, we were still able to get here in time. And I had arrived Sunday at 1:30 a.m. from Ontario, California. And then I looked at the agenda and I'm like, Linda, you have me starting again at 12:30. What if we don't make it there on time? Well, we made it with 1 hour to spare. And thank you, Jay. This is what he had me do in the afternoon. 1:15 through 5:45. 1:15 to 2:15, Larimer Cornerstone Village Community Room. The executive director, we saw the film and popcorn. 2:45 to 3:30, driving tour of Glen Hazel and Hawkins Village. 4:30 to 5:15, Pleasant Ridge, Jefferson Drive, Stowe Township, where they had the basketball courts and the golfs. And 5:15, 5:30, driving tour of Skyline Terrace. And then finally we get back. Now, what did I get to see in doing all of this? It brought back a lot of memories. I'm the kid that grew up in the housing projects of Crystal City, Texas. And even though I was born in San Antonio, Texas, for those of you that know about basketball, that's the Spurs that have won 5 nationals. Thank you very much. They haven't got anywhere in the last 2 years, but you know, they're recouping. But I grew up in the Mexican border town, Piedras Negras, Coahuila, and you have probably seen some of it in the last couple of weeks, because as the caravan of immigrants come, that's one of the areas where they have stopped. So that's where I grew up. My mom was a live-in maid, and my grandmother had been a maid as well in Mexico, my mom in Texas. So my grandmother told my mom, you can have this child when you have a home where the two of you can live. So my mom had to wait 9 years to get us a place in what I called upward mobility in the Crystal City housing projects. And that was the first time in my life that I had seen grass, and definitely those beautiful red brick homes. Because back home in Mexico, we live in the colonias, which are third world conditions. The restrooms were outhouses, and you went and got the softest newspaper that you couldn't find, which we then, I guess, could refer to as Charming, Cottonelle, or Northern. So that's what we did. And my mother worked extremely hard, 6.5 days per week, making $20. And in order to have some extra money, she also went and cleaned homes 3 times per week. And then on the weekends, she did a lot of ironing, and she was a phenomenal cook. And she made all that. That's how she made her little extra money, because she always believed. She was raised by my grandmother. I was raised by my grandmother. And she said, if you only have 10 pesos, you better at least save 2 pesos. You always have to have some money saved for a rainy day, so that you don't go knocking on doors asking for loans and those exorbitant interest. So my mother suffered from terrible asthma, but I never once saw her missing work. What I did see her doing when she had these asthma attacks, the doctor told her, do jigsaw puzzles, because you have to be sitting. You can't lie down because you can't breathe. And the one thing that I learned from my mother while seeing her doing that was that every puzzle, every picture starts with the 4 corners. And that's what I use for my life. Find the 4 corners and take it from there. I refer to this as the different partnerships. You have to have those 4 corners, and then you can start filling out the forms. But I do remember asking them, how do I get to the other schools? They said, well, you don't speak English. Well, teach me. So I finally got there. I got there because I was a little entrepreneur, and a lot of you here are entrepreneurs. The way I did it, I took an exam, and I flunked everything in English because I didn't know the language, but I had a perfect score in math. And they didn't believe that I could do that, so I had to take the test again. But this time, there were some teachers behind me. So I went ahead and did it again. And to this day, whenever I do math, I have to do it in Spanish. I cannot do it in English. So I went there like, 8 por 4, 32, and they're like, oh. So they rate the test again, and I made 100. And I'm like, okay. And so I come back the next year. Don't worry, I'm only going to take it through the 3rd grade. I'm not going to take it through all my life. And that summer, I actually went home back to my grandma, and that's where I learned English. I went to summer school. Because in Mexico, the poor people would save their little money to go and take English classes so they could become bilingual secretaries or bilingual bankers, because that's how you could make a little extra money. So I did go back, and I used to do the kids' math problems because they were kind of slow, and I had already been to school in Mexico 3 years. So that was good, but I got in trouble because I would charge them a nickel. So that, I always had money in my pocket. So I did finally make it to that wonderful 3rd grade, and I wanted to see that red brick school because I love baseball and I wanted to be able to play in the baseball team. And since I was a pretty good hitter and I could pitch or catch, I was usually one of their teams, so I did very well. But I remember my dream was always that little red brick school. Now, at times, and I know that some of our kids go through the same thing, going to that migrant school also required that when I went to lunch, we didn't have a cafeteria, of course, we just had one classroom. At 12:15, a bus would come to pick us up and take us to the cafeteria where the white kids went. And then you got to eat whatever was left over. And you could never sit with them, you had to sit separately. And I remember how annoyed I was. Sometimes it was embarrassing, sometimes it was humiliating. But the only important thing to me was, as long as I could get a small glimpse on a daily basis of what I wanted for my future, that annoyance, embarrassment, and humiliation was okay. And then I made it there, and I asked somebody, how can I get to college? So they laughed, they said, you can't. So I did. I became the high school valedictorian, and that was my ticket out of housing projects. And I went to Boston University, and luckily for me, all I wanted to do was to go to Radcliffe, which is now Harvard, and they only got me as far as the waiting list. They said, yeah, you were the valedictorian, but it's a little town. Most of our kids are private school, blah, 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 and of course I did not have a mother that was going to put $500,000 to get me there. But I didn't need it. I had earned it as valedictorian. Luckily for me, one of my freshman professors became my mentor, then and today, by the name of William J. Bennett. And the rest for me was history. He always would call me and says, kid, how are you doing? So we made it. And I lived the upper middle class lifestyle that lawyers will live. And when I left home, I promised myself I was never going to go back to that god-awful little town where there was so much hatred. At one time, the Hispanics took over, and all the whites left town. And to this day, that is the only small town, or probably the only town in all of the United States of America, where it is 100% Hispanic. They didn't want to be near the white, and the whites did not want to be near the Hispanics. So I grew up with that kind of hatred. That's why I always said, I'm not going back. Well, never say never. That gets me back to the issue of fair housing and housing. One day I get a call, and my mother did something that the women in my family rarely do, which was, she was crying. And this was the early 90s. So I asked what, unfortunately, the early 90s was when the drug dealers and drug syndrome, an epidemic, started taking place. And back then, the epidemic was marijuana, maybe some cocaine. It's not like opioids now, because it affects every single zip code in the country. And a lot of times, the kids will die within a matter of hours. And in some cases, 2 in the same family. So we did. And guess what I did? I went back home. I used all the contacts I had. I used all the resources I had. And not only did I go back home, I ran the housing authority where I grew up. And I agreed to live in the housing projects. I became the first executive director in the country to do that. And my job was, you want to dance? My job was get rid of the drug dealers, the pornographers, and child prostitution, which we had not seen when I was growing up. We were our parents were just hardworking people. And a lot of the people who were in the public housing didn't belong there. They were just using it as warehousing because, oh, you know, this is just public housing. What do you expect from them? So pretty soon I had a contract on my life, but the old story, you want to dance? I'm a Texas girl. I went and got two little friends. One was called not 357 Magnum under my car, and the other one was called 9mm right under my pillow. So, do you want to dance? I says, I know you can take me out if you want to, but I will take a few of you with me. The only question is, who wants to come with me? So I didn't take it personal when nobody wanted to come with me. And I do know what it is to get evicted. The mayor, after a while, she just couldn't stand me. I wouldn't hire her friends. I was evicting her friends. I wouldn't hire the city councilman, mayor's son, who was a drug dealer and a wife beater and had been kicked out of the jail. He was the warden there, can you imagine? So I got evicted. She went in and got new commissioners. This was March. In May, there was a city council election. And the folks said, if we get new people, will you come back and keep cleaning it? And I didn't think they were gonna do it. Came election time, they got rid of the mayor and two city councilmen. And guess what I got to say? I'm back. Boo. But it didn't take a fight at that point because the bad folks realized they no longer had control of the city. And we took care of it. Because like me, there are a lot of kids that want to do well and do well. And they are in public housing, they want to go to Section 8, then it's up to them where they go from there. And in fair housing, then President Bush wins and he gets me to HUD, so that's where I spent 8 years. And then he left and I took early retirement, and another one came, and my former professor, William Bennett, says, hey kid, ready to go work again? I go, but I'm retired, I'm enjoying life. I didn't ask you that. So I went back. And why did I go back to fair housing? Because this is also my way of paying back for everything that public housing did for my mom and for myself when we needed that refuge. And this is my way and our way of paying back. It wasn't given to us. A lot of people helped us. And now, what is it that fair housing does? Over the years, it started with the race, 1916, race national cases. 10 years later, you have national origin, family. That's the whole slew of cases. Then you have disability. And nowadays, one of the ones that you hear the most, just about everywhere, is sexual harassment. Nowadays, depending where you are in Region 3, 50% of the cases are disability cases. In other places, it's as high as 66% of the majority of the cases that we have deal with disability. Why? Because the people that were around 1968 are no longer 20 years old. They're older, and they're also in need of services. And within that 50 or 66%, 1/3 of those cases are emotional support animals. I know a lot about the elderly because, luckily for me, my mom in February turned 91. And I was very blessed when I had my swearing in Washington just with 3 people around, and then I went back home to be sworn in as Assistant Secretary. And I did it in the Senior Citizen Center around the people that I had grown up with, and invited all the executive directors of all the housing authorities, because that's where I came from. And the person that swore me in was a federal judge who arrived with 4 U.S. Marshals, because she too had a contract on her head. She's known as the tough hanging judge. She's put a lot of politicians away, a lot of bad people. And I hate to say this, but oftentimes people want to do good things. People expect their politicians to do good things. People expect their executive directors to do good things, and sometimes they don't. And unfortunately, in my little town, all 5 city councilmen, city mayor, and city manager at 7. All of them are in federal prison. And she's the lady that put them all away. And everyone dealt with a jury duty, and it was 95% Hispanics, and they found them all guilty because they violated the trust of the people. And when all those U.S. Marshals and FBI arrived and they went to the bank, they found out that the last $770,000 was also gone. So I often say that a lot of times programs don't work, not because the programs don't work. Sometimes the people that administer the programs don't do it right. And sometimes they abuse it. And you're dealing with someone that cannot tolerate that. And you're dealing with someone that will want to see you in jail. Now, I want to end with 2 things that are extremely important to us. Region 3, you've had a lot of sexual harassment cases that they've dealt with. Melody has had to deal with a mom who is in public housing or Section 8. And you know, for fair housing, we always said, opening doors for good housing. But we didn't always ask ourselves, what did the woman have to do to open the door? Or once inside, what did they have to do to keep it opened? And it did not mean that a maintenance director, executive director, or private landlord had the right to use their master key to go inside at all hours of the night and abuse the women with the children right next door. So when I started seeing those cases, I went to the secretary and said, I'm going to make very strong statements. And I told him what I had witnessed when I was 11, when the maintenance man went into my mom's house trying to put the moves on her. And my mom said no, and I was in the hallway, so I saw this, I heard this. And he says, okay, if not you, what about your daughter? And the next thing I heard was this, my mom just slapped the heck out of him. And because I love baseball, she says, you come back, I'll crack your head, and I'll crack your knees. It's like, you want to dance? You're not even going to be able to crawl out of here. And when I was telling the secretary that, he said, my mother went through the same thing. And by the time she got done with the perpetrator, his nose and ear was out of joint. So you have 2 very strong and committed and powerful individuals. And like my grandmother said, what the eyes see, the heart will always remember. And now we're in a position to do something about it. And so now every day you hear about this because they know we are doing something. I want to end by saying now about disability, especially of the elderly. I had the great pleasure of having my mom who's 91 years old, so I know all about the elderly. When you try to move them, even if it's just to the hospital for 2 days and back, for them it's very traumatic. And I know that with public housing and Section 8, we're going through a lot of reds and a lot of construction. It is extremely, extremely important that they, especially one of the relatives, know at all times what's happening. Because if you confuse them that much, it really affects them hugely. And since you are dealing with an assistant secretary who has a 91-year-old mom, I'm extremely protective of the elderly. And that I promise you. I don't want to hear the elderly being mistreated. I don't want to hear anybody being mistreated, but definitely not the elderly. Because I know I have my mom's permission to go boom, boom, boom. You know, it's like, you want to dance? Our job are probably some of the hardest jobs that we have. I've always said anybody dealing with social services, anyone dealing with people, it's hard. Because you see the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it stays with you. We don't do numbers, other than some data. We deal with people. But at the same time, you deal with that great pleasure when you know you have helped someone. Or the best thing is when a student comes to you and says, ma'am, I'm gonna be the historian. Can you come to my graduation? You know, you're like their second mom because you're the one that helped them get there. And I've always said, I don't have to imagine it, I've lived it. You can do all kinds of studies. And all it takes is one family member or one mentor, one person, to keep an eye on a child, and that child will do well. That's all they need, just one person to say, yes, you can do it, and if you didn't do it right the first time, don't worry, we'll try it again. It's like, that's why I tell little girls, learn how to play sports. You're gonna fall, you're gonna scrape, but that's okay. Just get up again and get that baseball bat. And yesterday, when I went to see one of the housing authorities that had the indoor basketball court, and go, I love that, because I ran a housing authority where we did stuff like that, except in our case, it was baseball. You have to have something for the kids to do. So what I recommend to all of us is we have to work as a team. Like my mom that put the jigsaw puzzles together, she was having her asthma attacks. You have to have the four corners. And the four corners are all of you. Because without that, the little jigsaw puzzle starts falling down. And with that, I want to thank you for all the work that you do and all the cooperation you do with Jay, because he does like to dance. You want to dance? And I've spoken with Barbara and with Melody. She has enormous patience, but above all, you want to pick their brains because they have decades of experience. So let's not see it as a fight, but let's see it as a cooperation to make things better for all of us. Thank you. One thing I learned from my grandmother is when you're invited to someone's home, in addition to saying thank you, you have to be proper and you have to reciprocate. So we brought something for you. And Melody, Barbara, we brought you a check.
Checks I like.
It's for the Fair Housing Partnership of Greater Pittsburgh for $300,000.
Wow, real check.
Fantastic.
I just want one of those, like the big checks.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You bet. And we have,
So, see, this one comes up. All right. So you can see, by the way, why I was so excited to have her here, because I like people who are the kind of people who want to get things done. Right? Having said that, I just want to take a second to speak on another little thing that we did during Fair Housing Month. So, part of the conversation is about having communities that are integrated, where people have the opportunity to live together and know each other. And so we reached out and we decided that we were going to do kind of a poster contest with the kids. Unfortunately, we wanted to have the kids here today, but it turns out that this week is their state testing, their PSSA testing. So I lost the opportunity to have them, so I apologize to that. But I just want to take a second to tell you about the kind of poster contest and the kids who participated and why we chose them. We looked at school districts, and one of the really interesting things is that Pittsburgh, just outside of Pittsburgh, the Woodland Hills School District happens to be a school district that is the last in the state of a forced integrated school district or consolidation. And they actually took 13 different communities throughout the area and made them into one school district. Predominantly black communities, predominantly white communities. And what has come from that has been the area kind of getting a sense of what their community really is. And that community's been challenged. Right? We have had real challenges. I actually live in that community, so I can speak to it kind of firsthand. We have had the challenges of the unfortunate shooting of our kids, and more than one. And so we provided the school district the opportunity to have the kids tell us what is community. And so, I don't know if you can click that for me because I can't get to it. I'm making Megan work away from her interpreter, so I'm a bad person right now. I'll take the heat for it. But I just want to kind of show you, and they were out and around. This is what the kids find as community. So we have some kind of really pretty artists, right, who are getting through it. I think they start to get the idea of where home is. Start to get a better sense from these kids of what home is and the love of a home. And that's what we're trying to do, is to provide that for them. Then we start to get really kids thinking about what we do to have our home. And you see and hear some of the kids talking about we stand up for each other, right? And that includes all of us, where we stand up for each other. Then we get really when we start to talk about why we have some of the housing segregation and why we have some of the discrimination, because there are these expectations of who we are in these communities about guns and ghettos and being disrespectful, and the reality of who we are in these communities, right? That we are the hardworking people, right? That we are helpful, that we have our history behind us. And this brings us to what was our winner of our poster contest from the elementary school. And I'll tell you right now, when I think of the work that we do in kind of the fair housing space, this is what I think we're doing it for. I want a place that I can allow people to feel safe, right? Where they can have the shelter that they need, where they can have their family, right? Their mom, and I particularly like this family because it's the kind of family that I know, with your mom and your grandma, and he's got a stepdad, and he's got him. This is the families for what we do fair housing for, why we do our work. I will finish just saying, while the kids weren't unable to be here, I was able to grab at least one of the school board members, Shari Seligson, who's over there. I'll make her stand up just so I can say thank you to her and for everything that they did for her school. With that, I am going to turn this over because I think we're going to start to transition into the panel time.
For those of you who don't already know me, I'm Megan Stanley. I'm the interim director of the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations. So we're going to shift gears now, and we're going to go into our panel discussion and speak a little more locally about fair housing issues, specifically talking about the rise of gentrification and patterns of segregation in housing here in Pittsburgh. Before I came to Pittsburgh, I lived in DC and I worked on Capitol Hill. And what I can tell you I truly appreciate about local government is how we get to see the impact of our local policies and legislation on a daily basis. When residents have a problem, they are able to bring it to us as it happens, and unlike our federal or state partners, we don't have to wait for the Senate or congressional budget to come out. We can just take action when we need to in real time, and we get to be held accountable by residents and the people that we serve. That's why I have so much respect for our moderator today. Councilman Lavelle of District 6 is someone who I know takes it upon himself to help residents who are having housing issues, whether they just need to have a local official listen to what's going on or enact new policies and legislation to help them. He's a lifelong Pittsburgher, with a brief break, who has served on city council since 2010. I have personally interacted with his staff at tenant council meetings and when they've taken it upon themselves to reach out to the commission to better understand the potential remedies for renters in his district. He also was a sponsor of the Affordable Housing Task Force and the Housing Opportunity Fund, which we will hear much more about. It's that kind of direct, on-the-ground work that can shape real change for Pittsburghers. So without further ado, please welcome our moderator, City Councilman Lavelle.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. We're going to attempt to have a lively and informed conversation, so I want to make sure everyone's with us. Megan already went over sort of the purpose and what we're going to be discussing, but prior to getting directly into the questions and allowing the guests to give a brief introduction about themselves, I actually wanted to run through a brief timeline of some of the policies that have actually helped shape our city and shape where we live, because policy has a very large implication on where we do live, the communities we end up in, and how we live in them. And this is by no way comprehensive. I was told I had like 2 minutes to say something before we really got going, so I just want to give a brief overview that'll help inform the conversation as we move forward. So, In 1923, the city of Pittsburgh enacts its first citywide zoning ordinance designing Pittsburgh's neighborhoods by prescribing what type of housing can be built where. An interesting part about this is, like many other ordinances at this time, the ordinance was actually designed to be exclusionary. And city planners sought to protect the value of homes rather than promote stable housing for everyone by limiting the quantity of housing stock so that only those above a certain income level could buy a home in that neighborhood, and by prohibiting the construction of more affordable apartments nearby. In 1937, the Housing Authority forms to provide quality low-income housing throughout the city of Pittsburgh. And then by the early 1960s, the agency had constructed 8 public housing projects, but placed in 6 of these communities, including St. Clair Village, Allegheny Dwellings, Northview Heights, Broadhead Manor, Arlington Heights, and Glen Hazel Heights, on steep hillsides isolated and disconnected from the larger community. And the Housing Authority is now going through a process to actually sort of redo those communities and make sure they actually are connected into the greater fabric of those communities. Also in 1937, local realtors drew the residential security map of Pittsburgh for the Homeowners Loan Corporation. This led to direct redlining. These realtors graded Pittsburgh's neighborhoods according to a sharply prejudiced rubric outlining poor immigrant or black communities as they definitely declining or hazardous for investment. Their map divided the city into 2 groups of neighborhoods. In the first were affluent white neighborhoods, Squirrel Hill, Brookline, for instance, where lenders were encouraged to invest heavily. And in the second group, Jewish, immigrant, black, and poor communities, such as the Hill District or Hazelwood, where lenders were advised not to lend. In 1949, the Housing Authority finished St. Clair Village housing community and institutes a racial quota system for development, which was, again, also ended up very discriminatory because many whites did not want to live where blacks wanted to live, and so those housing projects became majority African American. In 1955, City Council approves an urban renewal plan to raise the Lower Hill District and replace it with the Civic Arena. As we all know, they displaced over 8,000 families. Many of those families moved to East Liberty, to Homewood, also destroying the economic fabric of the African American community in Pittsburgh, which again was devastating that we still have not recovered from. In 1958, City Council enacts a fair housing ordinance barring discrimination in rental, sale, purchasing, or financing of residential housing because of race, color, religion, ancestry, or national origin, which was a decade before the Federal Fair Housing Act. In 1977, the Pennsylvania passes the Local Economic Revitalization Tax Assistance Act that empowers any municipality to subsidize economic development by providing tax breaks to developers building in economically depressed area. And since 1993, there have been 58 LRTA and tax increment financing TIF agreements in this city, disproportionately in a handful of neighborhoods such as downtown East Liberty and the Strip District. In 1986, the U.S. Congress creates the Low Income Housing Tax Credit as part of the Tax Reform Act of 1986. In 1996, the Housing Authority in the city of Pittsburgh began to demolish public housing in Pittsburgh. In 1999, the Housing Authority had planned to demolish 38 buildings, more than a quarter of its total units. In 2000, the Housing Authority reaches an agreement with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, to become a moving to work designated authority. In 2014, the Housing Authority is awarded a $30 million grant for the Larimer Choice Neighborhood Project to create better quality, environmentally friendly housing in a mixed income development. Congratulations. In 2015, the City of Pittsburgh enacts an ordinance to protect low-income tenants from housing vouchers from discrimination. That's the source of income legislation, which, if you're not aware, is actually being challenged in court as we speak. Also in 2015, residents at Penn Plaza Apartments in East Liberty received a 90-day eviction notice illustrating the insecurity of affordable housing in Pittsburgh. In 2016, the Affordable Housing Task Force, established in 2015, published its findings and recommendations. The task force identified a shortage of 17,241 affordable units in the city of Pittsburgh. The first recommendation was to create a housing opportunity fund to directly help fund those projects. In 2017-2018, City Council approves $10 million per year for 12 years And for the Housing Opportunity Fund, it appoints the Housing Opportunity Fund Advisory Board members, and the Housing Opportunity Fund works on its annual allocation plan. And now in 2019, the Housing Opportunity Fund is actually spending those resources to help people in need of stabilizing housing, help people from becoming homeless, help develop more affordable housing in the city of Pittsburgh. With that as sort of a background, I now want to open it up to our panelists to give a brief 3-minute overview of them. I would like them to directly talk about how they've experienced housing discrimination as well as gentrification if they can. First, I will begin with Megan Stanley, who is the Pittsburgh Commission Director for the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations.
Make sure the mic is on. All right. So I already introduced myself, Megan Stanley. I want you to know that the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations, much like our partners at the State Commission on Human Relations, investigate complaints of discrimination, not only in housing, also in employment and public accommodations. So we investigate these complaints, we uphold laws like the Fair Housing Act and the Civil Rights Act and the amendments to those laws. We also focus heavily on outreach and education, and that's something that in 2019 we're really focusing even more on. We have a brand new outreach staff who is here, who will be going out into communities to talk about how can we not just be reactive and not just investigate complaints of discrimination, but how can we be really proactive before the discrimination ever happens? How can we be a part of the community and let people know these are the rights that you have as residents and as tenants? For landlords, property owners, developers, what are your obligations under these laws? What are the things that you need to make sure that you're upholding before you get to the point where you're making discriminatory actions? So we really are working on furthering our outreach efforts. We're partnering a lot with the FIP. You heard from Jay earlier and Megan as well from Fair Housing Partnership to make sure that everybody in Pittsburgh who works in fair housing is on the same page. We're going out into the communities together and we are telling people these are the rights that you have, and if you think they've been violated, please come and tell us. We want to know so that we can both right the wrongs, but that we can be there even before that so people feel empowered and they know what rights they have. Specifically speaking about gentrification and segregation, we have seen an increase in the past year specifically in housing discrimination complaints. And these are under a lot of different protected classes. I wouldn't say that there is one that we've seen an increase in. It's race, it's national origin, it's religion, it's disability, familial status. We cover 14 total protected classes. But we have seen a rise in these as people are becoming displaced with increased development. So it really matters to the commission staff that we, again, are being proactive in saying before gentrification happens or there's increased rents or housing prices in a neighborhood, what can we do to make sure that that neighborhood can stay intact, that people who have lived there for years get to stay there, that generations of a family get to stay where they have grown up, while also making way for development and economic revitalization.
Hi, my name's Megan Confer-Hammond. I'm the program director at the Fair Housing Partnership. Just as a quick introduction for gentrification is that the Fair Housing Act is very personal to me. I moved to Pittsburgh in 2003 coming from Maryland, and I grew up in Maryland in public housing. And I went to college trying to find a path to understand how the public housing I grew up in came to be. And looking back on it now, I can realize in high school that the doodles I was drawing in school was neighborhood planning, and I called my neighborhood Camelot. And I tried to find a way to make it equal no matter what our socioeconomic background was. And in architecture, I was studying buildings, but I was struggling to find the class that was about the people. And after I moved out of the dormitories, I lived in Point Breeze. And I would walk, because I never had a car, and I would walk to the Shakespeare Street Giant Eagle. And at that time, the Nabisco factory was abandoned, the Reisenstein Middle School was still there and abandoned, and that walk was a really long, hot slog to get up Penn Avenue to the Giant Eagle and then hauling my groceries back to my house. And it was just these massive concrete abandoned buildings where there was no peace and there was no shade. And I just remember that walk to get groceries being grueling all the time. And then Bakery Square happened. And the Nabisco factory became a gym and Google offices and Pitt offices and a clothing store I still can't even afford and a coffee shop. And then the abandoned middle school became high-end apartments that I can't afford. And then they built an air bridge between the apartments and the shopping development so that the staff that worked, the Google employees and the Pitt employees, could walk across in a air-conditioned, heated environment from their apartment to their place of work. And every time I would pass it, I was watching this development happen. I couldn't help but wonder and think and try to find a solution to, why does Google get to live where they work and not even have to worry about their commute in the rain and the snow of Pittsburgh? But where is the support staff for that office building? The janitors? Where is the staff at the coffee shop or the staff at the gym? Why are we taking 1 or 2 or even more buses, given how our bus system pulls you into downtown, doesn't go from neighborhood to neighborhood? Why do we have to take all of these extra steps just to get to work when there is apartments right across the street from that complex? And more people worked at that complex than the high-end earners who could afford the apartments across the street. And to me, I have held that close to my heart as I've looked at the development of Pittsburgh, to constantly use my role to challenge and put that question in front of the decision makers. How are we supporting everyone that we are building for? Because we don't bring Google alone, we don't bring the coffee shop alone, we don't bring the gym alone. It comes with the support staff that makes it all possible. And we all have a right to live, eat, work, and play in those areas that are becoming the greatest and the best to be in Pittsburgh.
Peace and good afternoon. My name is Knowledge Build Hudson. I'm the Government Relations Liaison and Special Project Coordinator at the Housing Authority City of Pittsburgh. So prior to the Housing Authority, I started community development work in around 2010, working with colleagues of mine doing a study around migration, specifically identifying the fact that there's a lack of a middle-class Black Pittsburgh. So we tried to identify why did middle-class folks move out of Pittsburgh who are Black. What we learned through our studies is that there was a lot of vacancy that was left behind due to these migrations to Penn Hills, to North Hills, to the East Coast. And then I started to learn about gentrification, right? So before gentrification is neighborhood change. Through this vacancy, you had a lot of neighborhood change, whether it was investment and also divestment. I was fortunate enough to volunteer on the Alarm Consensus Group board and play a role in helping the Housing Authority attain, or the Housing Authority and the community attain a $30 million grant. And through that arduous process, I really got dug in and wanted to be a part of the solution, to be able to bring people back to the city, but also to be able to solve problems for people who were receiving HUD assistance. So I applied to the Housing Authority. There was an opportunity there to work with elected officials as a government relations liaison, and then also the special projects coordinator. So under the special projects, I do a lot of things to create equity. One of the things is this digital equity program called Connect Home PGH. So the goal of it is to be able to connect people to opportunities using digital devices, using digital literacy, as well as using access to the internet, so they can have opportunities to change their space in place, right? So I appreciate my opportunity to play a part of the solution to solve these problems. So gentrification comes after neighborhood change, but we have to be able to help everyone do these processes. And I'm proud to know there's a lot of people here that are at the part of the Housing Authority who are working with me. So it's not just myself, it's a team of people who are working to solve these problems. Peace.
Thanks, Knowledge. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bill Gaddy, president and founder of Trek Development Group. It's great to see so many old friends here. And it just reminds me of how really just small this industry is in Pittsburgh. And I know many of you here, and it feels good to all be in the same room to tackle these important issues. We've been at it since 1991. I founded Trek back then, and in some ways, the cliche, like the more we learn, the less we know, we feel like more bewildered in some ways than ever with this changing marketplace. I mean, to be honest, we got involved with affordable housing in 1991 with tax credits, particularly the 9% credits, because that was the only way to be a real estate developer back then in this region if you didn't have any money, which is the place I was in. It was it was an on-ramp, it was a production. So we worked with that and struggled with that, and somewhere along the way, we found our voice, found our mission, which is create value, enhance lives, and strengthen communities. create value being the financial aspect of what we do, which is important. It has to be viable, it has to be sustainable. Enhanced lives was our look at our residents. How are we're not making their lives perfect, but we put everything through the lens of enhancing their lives in every way we can. And then these strengthened communities, the third part of our mission was that outward look. How can what we're doing strengthen what's happening all around it and add to it, be additive to communities? So that's really where our mission came into focus around 2007 when we purchased the Century Building downtown, which was March 31st, 2007. I remember it well. It was the first real mixed income development in this region. 65% market rate, 35% affordable. And we just took this notion of, hey, people of different ages, incomes, races, and classes in an urban environment want to live together. The new generation is less concerned, perhaps, than the previous generation about sorting themselves out by race and class. That was the hypothesis. It's never been an issue at the Century Building. It's been a great investment and a great place to live. Our offices are there. I go there every day. I know many of the residents. So we went on and tried to reprise that in many other places. I know that the Housing Authority has done great work in the mixed income area. We did some home ownership conversion developments in the Hill District on Dinwiddie Street. That started in 2009 and continues today. We developed the brew house lofts on the south side, the old Duquesne Brewery, where that's actually 60% affordable, 40% market rate. That has this very unique bohemian arts component to it. So it's been something I'm proud to be associated with. So we're kind of right in, and in the early 90s, no housing was happening in this town, period, that wasn't subsidized in some way. So now that the market is finally caught up, there finally is a market, it's flipped the narrative to a point where now our services, all of our services, are more vital than ever. So I'm just happy to be at the table and part of that conversation, figuring out these complex problems.
Hi, everybody. My name is Celeste Scott. I am the Housing Justice Organizer of Pittsburgh United. I am also the Housing Chair of Sisters PGH, and I'm also on the board of Landless People's Alliance. So Pittsburgh United is a permanent coalition of environmental, community, faith, and labor organizations, and we really believe in throwing down and fighting together and being proactive instead of reactive. My history was gentrification and displacement and segregation. I think I've lived it all. I am a queer, single, Black mother in Pittsburgh, and we know that everything here disproportionately affects us. So I've lived it. I've been evicted multiple times. I've been homeless. I have lived through all of these systems. And I think what I really work towards is people like me, the people that have lived experience being the experts and the impact that people really having power at the table. Not just creating a table for people to sit at with your own agenda, but making sure that people that are affected, they have the power and they're shaping the agenda. So I really believe that policy should be community controlled, that development should be people-centered, and that we really need to work together to do these things. So that's me.
So thank you. And just so everyone is aware, we anticipate the panel taking approximately 30-35 minutes, after which we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. First question, this is for all the panelists. What are some misconceptions about fair and affordable housing, and how can we best address these misconceptions?
One misconception is that fair housing means low income. And I think that one way you can solve that is by changing the narrative that, fair housing, or affordable housing even, that affordable housing means 30% of your income, right? So affordable housing could be, if you're a millionaire, you could still have something that you're overpaying. So I think that, to help educate people to understand what it really means, affordable housing, versus the stigma that's presented through the news and the media.
Just one add I'd make to that, affordability, and this is sort of an add-on to Knowledge's statement, is it comes in all shapes and sizes. A deeply subsidized affordable unit, where maybe a tenant's paying $200 or $300 a month. Some people say affordable when they say 80% of the area median income, which might be over $1,000 a month. So that's a pretty big range for a person of modest means, 300 to 1,000. The other misconception I'd say is that people, where I stated earlier, people of different ages, incomes, race, and class are not willing to live together. I believe that is a misconception. We found that that's not the case.
I just wanted to touch on the misconception with affordable housing is that affordable correlates, unfortunately, in the mainstream with lazy. And no one worked harder than my mom as a single mom of 4 kids, as a deaf mom, struggling to get access. And then what happens is when we correlate lazy with affordability, and then we also correlate across so many different protected classes due to systemic and historical decisions that has led to poverty within our groups of who we are. And I say that because I recognize that myself, I recognize where I have struggled because of discrimination as a woman, as a deaf woman, as a gay woman, but I also recognize my whiteness, for example. And in my extended family, I have an aunt who is particularly wealthy. And my own personal immediate family were extremely poor. We had our utilities shut off. We got food from the food pantry. We never had enough of anything as I was growing up. And me and my siblings worked extraordinarily hard through our lives. But I say that because my sister, she went to Duquesne, and after her first semester at Duquesne, she was not allowed to come back in the second semester. And she only found out days before winter break ended. And that was because my mother hadn't been approved for any of the loans. And she was so embarrassed, she didn't tell us. And so my sister received an email and a phone call that none of her balance had been paid, and so she could not come back to the university. And what happened in that singular moment, my sister, who is now a tenured first grade teacher in Montgomery County, Maryland, living in the snobby area of town we always made fun of growing up, is that my very wealthy aunt stepped in and paid the balance and helped her get the loans that would let her complete her education. So the idea that if we just work hard enough, we'll be successful is absolutely false. And so to correlate affordability with laziness, that we haven't worked hard enough, is such a misconception that I want to eradicate out of mainstream society, because we are working extraordinarily hard. And there are systems in place against us that have made even our hardest working efforts not take us to where we're trying to get to, and that we all need a leg up in order to get there.
Good? All right. Go ahead.
Oh, I would just, last thing, I think all of these are great points. I think the biggest misconception about fair and affordable housing is that they're the same thing. People equate them. They say, that's affordable housing, that's fair housing. That's not true. It doesn't matter if it's affordable if you can't access that housing because they are going to discriminate against you for other reasons. Speaking from a place of my own privilege as a middle-class white woman, it's true that the first thing I look at when I'm looking for housing is the price tag, right? What rent can I afford? That's what I'm looking for. But there are people who can't access housing because of their religion, because of their race, because they have children and they're being told that they can't have those children in housing. Affordability at that point doesn't matter. So when we talk about fair housing, that doesn't just mean you can afford it. That is a huge part of it, and I think it's what's top of mind for all of us. But it also means, can you access it? Does your protected class status matter? And I think that gets lost in the conversation, and I want to bring that back to the forefront.
Thank you. What role do I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
I think a common misconception is that we can have conversations about affordable housing and not have conversations about fair housing along with it. I know me and Jay talk about that a lot. So I think that's a common misconception. Also, the conversation about concentrated poverty always meaning black folks being displaced. That's a problem for me. And also the conversation that black communities are bad communities, which is a very racialized, colonized conversation that constantly happens. So, and I also think there's a misconception that folks that are cash poor don't deserve to have safe, quality, and affordable housing, and that they have to choose between having quality housing or affordable housing. You should not have to choose that. And also, I think that a lot of people don't even know that they're protected classes. They don't know about their fair housing rights. So we have to do a better job. If we got to get out, canvas, door knock, whatever we need to do to authentically reach people, because people are powerful. And low-income people, whatever you would like to call us, I'm one of those people who come from those communities. We are powerful people. We are our own experts. We know what we need. So I think there's a common misconception that we deserve to survive and not to thrive in this city, especially in Pittsburgh, Black Pittsburgh, where there's definitely two cities here. So I just want to raise that up, that you might see pretty rivers and pretty bridges, but there's an underbelly here that we have to get uncomfortable, start talking about, and work towards solving.
Thank you. You can actually hold the mic, Celeste, because I'm going to ask you to address the next question. You, as well as Ms. Confer-Hammond, what role do populations and communities traditionally in power play in promoting fair housing practices?
Well, so populations and communities traditionally in power are usually, especially in Pittsburgh, affluent and white populations. And what role do they play in promoting fair housing? A lot of times they can promote the segregation pieces. We see a lot in Pittsburgh that there are a lot of neighborhoods that are segregated, and that they often move Black folks, into concentrated places and away from amenities. It's really a practice here. So I'm hoping that a role that communities in power can be flipped, and that folks that are considered marginalized can be in power and play better roles in shaping our own destiny. So that's what I think.
I think in getting the word out there about the Fair Housing Act is that, to the point before, is that there's a difference between the landlord-tenant access and what discrimination means. And the difficulty of the Fair Housing Act is that we cover protected classes, so we're trying to reach all those individual groups. And it's very targeted and very specific to get that awareness out there. And there's an onus on us to be comfortable in a variety of groups and to use we language to relate to each other no matter who we are, in order to have honest conversations about the power and privilege and oppression that we're all facing and dealing with. And I say that particularly when I started at the Fair Housing Partnership. It's a story I've told everyone in my family, where I had asked my college admissions counselor, or guidance counselor in college, whether or not I should say I'm deaf in my job interviews. And my admissions guidance counselor said, absolutely, you wouldn't want to work at a place that doesn't accept you because of your deafness. And the reason is I grew up in Maryland. I'm from Maryland. My identity is Maryland. But it's not because my family has roots in Maryland. It's because my parents, two deaf people, moved from their home states to attend Gallaudet, the deaf university in the States. And so I was struggling with what to do. My parents had taught me to be hearing, to give me more opportunity, because they knew what I would face if I presented as deaf, if I couldn't pass as hearing. So I say all of that to say that my guidance counselor told me, yes, you should absolutely divulge that information. And my mom laughed at me. And she said, I'm not paying your rent or your electric bill. You have to get a job. Your guidance counselor doesn't have to face the denials that you're gonna get when you state that. So absolutely not, you keep your mouth shut until you get a job. And that's the mindset I was going into in my job application process out of college. And my very last interview one day was with Jay Dorn, the executive director at FHP. And at the very bottom of my resume, under special skills, I put fluent in sign language, in ASL, American Sign Language. And as I sat down in a very crowded auditorium, I could barely hear, and I've been struggling all day to interact with the interviewers. He started bombarding me with questions about how dare I lie about knowing sign language on my resume, and that how dare I try to conflate passing knowledge of ASL as being fluent, and who did I think I was? And I couldn't get a word in for 5 minutes trying to explain, no, I was deaf and I did know ASL, but I was trying to hide it so you wouldn't know. So that way you would hire me, then I'd tell you later and we'd work it out. And then as soon as I told him, when he stopped talking long enough for me to explain what was going on with my resume and why I'd put that in there, I was welcomed at FHP because of it, because we were pursuing housing discrimination cases based on discrimination against the deaf and hard of hearing and disabilities that impact your speech. And that moment has stuck with me, and I've told everyone, I'm not at FHP because of the hours or the pay, but it's moments like that is why I have given my career to the Fair Housing Act and recognizing how particular and welcoming and inclusive we have to be in order to get this message out to all protected classes to feel like I did in that moment after a lifetime of being turned away because of who I was.
Thank you. Can fair housing provisions for development, such as inclusionary zoning, really make an impact on the effects of gentrification for marginalized populations? What?
Okay. So I do, so we are working on inclusionary zoning in Lawrenceville right now, an interim planning overlay district. But thinking about it in a fair housing way and how inclusionary zoning, I think there should be affordable and fair housing in every neighborhood. If I want to live in Squirrel Hill, I should be able to. If I want to live wherever I want to live, I should be able to. And not only should I be able to live there, I should have the same amenities that the market rate development has. And I really think with the inclusionary zoning, we have to think about the level of affordability. So, we want it to be 50% area median income and below so that people can use vouchers. So I do think that inclusionary zoning can have an impact. Of course, it's one tool in the toolbox, just like the Housing Opportunity Fund is one tool in the toolbox. And we're gonna have to get all of the tools together, all of the systems together, working in the same direction for inclusionary zoning to really work. Because we know that we don't want to have another Lawrenceville where the Somali Bantu populations and all the Black folks and all the voucher holders have been erased from the community. We want to get in front of it like Hazelwood and the Hill and Homewood, where we see gentrification is coming, and we want to have inclusionary zoning there so that every development has to have a level of affordability at the lowest levels, and that everybody has the same rights to amenities that they should have. So that's my answer.
So I'd be interested in hearing Bill's perspective, because inclusionary zoning also works assuming the developer participates in the inclusionary zoning plan. There are cities like Chicago where almost all developers opt out, and they sort of pay a fee to not do the inclusionary zoning. So I'm just curious from a development
Councilman, why don't you ask the next question and I can do those two together?
Okay.
So to go back to the Fair Housing Act, this continues to be so personal to me. And to go back one more time, if you'll bear with me for a story, is that I learned after I joined the Fair Housing Partnership, and I finally figured out what had gotten me into architecture, is that I am a product of inclusionary zoning. And that why I had been fascinated with neighborhood siting and neighborhood development is because my mom left my father when I was 6. And what I now understand is that our house had been foreclosed on, we had been evicted from our townhouse, our rental, and we were homeless, living in a farmhouse with friends in West Virginia. And my mom drove away and had had enough. And as a single deaf mom, a year later, her application process had gotten her into an inclusionary zoning unit in Montgomery County, Maryland, where inclusionary zoning had been passed in the 80s. And what that was there was 10 piggyback townhouses in a neighborhood of $250,000 townhouses that others owned. And we were sort of tucked in the corner of this development. And we went to visit it while it was being constructed, because it was brand new constructed. We were ecstatic to be moving out of a tiny cramped apartment we were living in Frederick, Maryland. And we moved in, and we knew we were different. We had a parking lot, not a driveway. We didn't have a backyard. We didn't have a basement. But we were there, we were present. And then there was an empty space in between our units and the homes that were owned. And then they built a park there. And so on one hand, I delivered newspapers to the homeowners to help my mom make ends meet. On the other hand, we all played at the same park. Then Halloween came, and we all went trick-or-treating together. And then as I went through what is a very good school district, I went through this process where my friends gave me access, so no matter how chaotic my home life was, I had access to friends who, one of my friends, her dad was on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire with Regis Philbin, and we heard stories about that. Another friend, they always invited me over for the sleepovers, and they gave me rides. And so when they were in AP and honors classes, I was in AP and honors classes as well. And eventually, when I applied to college, as they were applying to college, and I got into Carnegie Mellon, and I get on campus, and I go to the disability office, and I say, okay, I'm here, so where are the other deaf students? Can I meet them? And the disability staff there looked at me and said, there are none. Maybe one or two, and they're not culturally deaf, because they don't qualify. Because this is a very competitive school, and access to education for people with disabilities is historically very difficult. He didn't say all of that, but now I understand. And so I was fascinated with and studied and had gotten me to FHP to understand where we put people, what we have access to, how we get there, and having the opportunity to be in a good school district with friends who focused on their studies as well, to live next to a grocery store, to live within an area where we could function when my mom lost her car, made a complete and utter difference in my life. And I have 4 siblings. One of us has a master's, one of us has a bachelor's, one of us just finished her associate's, and my brother graduated from trade school in electricity. So we like to joke with my mom that she has one of each after the access and opportunity, that no matter what she couldn't deal with, the inclusive zoning that we lived in, that unit we lived in, is what gave me and my siblings an opportunity.
Thank you. The next question, then we'll ask Bill to begin. What rights do developers and property owners have to pursue their own gains in the housing market? How do their rights contradict or intersect with civil rights of protected marginalized classes?
I have to defend developer rights. It's going to be tough. So, well, I mean, of course, we live in a capitalist society, and so we're the country's built on this pursuit, but measured pursuit is, of course, the name of the game. Just a couple of things. It's as a real estate developer, we stare at spreadsheets all day and try to figure out how to make projects work and deals work. It's not just developers say, oh, I want to make $1 zillion. They're usually not deploying their own money. They're deploying somebody else's money. So there's investors and there's lenders, banks. And when a real estate investor shows up and invests equity, they want 16 to 18% return on investment. That's what's considered a risk-adjusted return in real estate. Occasionally, investors will show up in our office that say, hey, we're a kinder, gentler investor. We really like what you're doing. We really want to deploy capital, and we don't have as high return requirements as these other greedy equity real estate investors out there. But when you get to the end of that conversation, it's like 14, 15% that they want. So it takes a while to get there, but it's not that much different. And then, banks, that's a high, the interest rates are interest rates. That's Federal Reserve. So if you can't pay your debt, they're going to foreclose on you just like anybody else. And although I support the efforts of what's going on in Lawrenceville, the market rent in Lawrenceville in a new property is probably $2.25 a square foot. So their average one bedroom is maybe $1,800 a month. 10% affordability at 50% is probably what, $500-600, something like that? Yeah, $500-600. So that's close to $1,000 a month times 10%. So that's going to take a huge bite out of the bottom line and may make some projects infeasible. I just think it's something we have to understand what we're asking for. That will require a deep subsidy. I think it's a good thing to pursue because it's going to force test developers who are mission driven to really figure out ways to do this, and it'll elevate the level of discourse around these important ideas. But it's complicated, and it won't go without ramifications.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond to that?
I think I could simply say for that question, it depends on the developer, and it depends on their development. I know Stacy is over here, Northside Coalition for Fair Housing, where Black women became and men became the developer, right? So I think it really does depend on the developer and the development. A lot of things in Pittsburgh are by right. I know we're working on LERTAs and TIFs and making sure that you do not get to build just by right, but that there are things codified that make things fair. There were billions of dollars of tax credits given out in East Liberty and no affordability. Like, that can't keep happening. That can't happen again. So I think some things should not be by right. And I think it depends on the developer. And again, I think it should be people-centered development. And when we do development, we really need to go out to the community, have authentic engagement, not just meetings with pro formas and things like that where people don't understand. We really have to really be doing our work to make sure the development has the correct impact on the community that the community wants.
Thank you. Next question, I'm going to ask Knowledge to answer first. Is there a right or wrong method of housing development for immigrants and refugees? What are the concerns with areas of low or high concentration of immigrants?
So in my role as government relations, a lot of elected officials and people from other agencies asked about Northview Heights, which we have a large population of Somali Bantu community families. And so I did some investigation at the Housing Authority, and I learned that the residents are actually going through the process of getting housing just like everyone else would, and they'll only choose Northview Heights. They'll wait a year to live in Northview Heights. And I further realized that this style of a harmonious or cultural movement, like immigrants basically immigrate together. And it's because like they're there to help each other. They want to be with people that speak the same language. And you'll see these examples like for the Japanese and the Bay Area, the Eritreans and DC, El Salvadorians, DC, even the West Indians in New York City. So this is very common amongst the immigrant population that they'll actually move together. At the Housing Authority, what we did though is we hired a full-time staff member that was able to speak these languages and have them in Northview Heights to be able to help the residents, whether it's with a lease or whether it's with any issues that they may be dealing with. They're male, they could come to our offices and get things translated. We also have people who speak multiple languages to translate documents. So when they receive documents, they're in the language that they speak. So we try to respond to the fact that their methodology of moving or their cultural, the other thing is that there's different they have different cultural norms, you know, so like learning just because they speak the same language, that they're not just the same folks. So it's a learning process, but I think that it needs to be taken with precaution and care and listening to understand these communities.
Thank you. Anyone want to add?
Yeah, I'd just like to add, I think that from the Commission's perspective, we really see two sides to this. As Knowledge Build said, of course, groups of immigrants and refugees, when they're coming here, it's an unfamiliar place, and so they're often going to stay in groups together, and we want to encourage that. At the same time, it makes them very vulnerable, and what we have seen, for example, with our Bhutanese population in Pittsburgh, there's a pretty high concentration of Bhutanese immigrants that have come here. They don't have a great trust in the government, just in general, and we have to recognize the Commission is a government agency. You have to come through metal detectors and know the right elevator in our building just to get to us, just to make a complaint. And then you're making an official complaint, and all of these things have to feel really odd to them, and they probably don't have a lot of trust in us, even if we haven't done anything directly to that population. So we need to respond to that by going out into the community and not just saying, hey, we're here, talk to us, and forcing ourselves on them, but just having a presence. So it's going to places like BCAP and just being there and sitting there in community meetings and just having a continual presence and building up a level of trust with them, so that when they do feel ready, we know that there are discrimination issues going on. I can tell you what they are right now, but none of them have come to us to make a complaint because they're not comfortable yet. So we have to wait. If that takes a year or 2 years or 5 years, we have to just be there and get comfortable with them and have them get comfortable with us, so that they get to a place where they can trust us enough to tell us what's going on, and we can take action on their part and also advocate for them.
I just wanted to say around immigrants and refugees, there's a lot of colorism here. around and anti-Blackness around immigrants and refugees. AWACE, Somali Bantu Community Neighborhood Association, sits at my table, as well as OMAR. And I know a lot of the things that they express wanting to have access to is control over their housing situation. So OMAR actually is buying houses and buying property for their specific cultural views. So I think we have to think about that as well, that immigrant and refugee populations are different and that there is colorism and anti-Blackness, as we even see in our federal government that's being expressed. So making sure that all immigrants and refugees have access to the same resources, and also speak in their own voices and have power to control their situations as well, and that we're not speaking for them.
Thank you. Next question I'm going to ask either Megan to begin. Last year, the Me Too movement highlighted the countless experiences women have had with sexual harassment in their workplace. Sexual harassment is protected under the Fair Housing Act. How can we reach out to victims and make it easier for them to report their experiences when a landlord or owner sexually harasses a tenant?
So I think it's important to recognize that the Me Too movement, when we talk about sexual harassment, we tend to be just talking about the experiences of women being victimized by men in power. And while that is definitely the thing that we're hearing about, I want to recognize that anybody can be a victim and anybody can be a perpetrator. These are often things that aren't brought to our attention. So I think, as the Assistant Secretary was talking about earlier, these are problems that are flying under the radar. It's the maintenance man. So it might not even be your landlord. It's the maintenance man saying, oh, for me to make the repairs to your stove, which I know you need, or your heater because it's the Pittsburgh winter and it's 0 degrees in a polar vortex. For me to do that, I'm just going to need a favor. There's going to be a quid pro quo. And people fear for losing their housing, so they don't want to make an official complaint about that. So it's up to us to get out into these communities and talk to everybody, not just groups of women, not just groups of men, transgender, gay, straight, white, black, every person, to say, you could be a victim, or maybe you're unwittingly perpetrating something like this. You're furthering these behaviors. So these are your rights that you have, and I want to empower you, and these are the responsibilities that you have as somebody in power. So I think it's really about education, and again, making people feel comfortable that they can come to us and let us know what is going on.
The difficulty with sexual harassment in the Fair Housing Act, in my experience, has been that the methodology for pursuing a case is to have multiple survivors come forward in order to make your proof. And in dealing with developing and establishing to file fair housing cases ever since 2010 now, is that I understand that the first response we'll hear from the perpetrator is, of course not. That never happened, and to say a series of statements in which to try to disprove it. And so I work diligently to both stay on top of what is going on with the sexual harassment cases in order to better find a way to respond to those calls. Because I understand the severity of it, the nearness of it that is happening right now. One of my very first calls when I started taking calls at FHP was a woman who lived outside of Allegheny County, so a bit further away in western Pennsylvania than where I was in Pittsburgh. And her landlord had sent her a mattress, and it was on the porch with a note that said, I can't wait to help you put this to good use. And I was just torn with, how can I help her get through this process? The landlord has that master key that the Assistant Secretary mentioned. The access to the unit, the rural nature of it, the immediacy of what could happen next. And in this situation, the filing of the fair housing complaint, the letterhead, the document saying that we are watching what you are doing and we are responding to that, was enough to make the landlord back down and settle with a financial agreement to help her find a new place to live since she no longer felt safe. And so the difficulty that I continue to address is this frustration with when the survivors come forward is what I know will be the response back. If everyone here saw the Castle Shannon landlord case last year in the news, where the woman, and unfortunately we didn't get that knowledge to her, so she didn't make a fair housing case, she made a criminal case. But what she had done was she felt that someone was in her unit, and so she put a camera in her unit to figure out what was going on. And she caught the landlord in her unit doing an unspeakable act. And in the fair housing methodology, she now has to do it again for a second time in order to remove his defense that's going to be, and what it was, that was the first and only time I was overcome with myself and I acted in this way. I would never have done this again, or I've never done that before. And ultimately, I believe he only received house arrest for maybe 6 months. So I struggle with, and I do my very best to both explain what the rights are, what the realistic process is going to be, and what we're going to need to do as I try to find new ways to make these cases, because the process of having an overwhelming amount of evidence to beat back the defense of prove it is a very difficult phone call to have. And we are absolutely a resource to pursue any claims of sexual harassment or assault in housing.
Thank you. What is the best pathway for someone who has experienced housing inequality or knows someone who is experiencing housing inequality to make change in their community?
As an activist, I know I'm going to say that the best pathway is for folks to get together and for folks to organize together and for folks to build power together to make change in their community. Even around policies like the House Opportunity Fund, people told us we couldn't do it, but I believe with the power of people that you can do anything. So I think the best pathway is to find some like-minded folks to organize. Miss Mickey, Miss Michelle has gotten people together in D-Rod for years, working by herself, working in the Mon Valley, and now she has organized people to really make a change, to change the conditions in her community. So I think the best pathway is always to organize and to build your own power to fight the systems that you need to fight.
Thank you.
I would add on to that. I was going to say much of the same thing. I think, you know, the commission takes the complaints of discrimination. Housing inequality is not always a case of discrimination. We have a pretty narrow scope under the law, but we certainly care about housing inequality. And I don't think you can underestimate the power of a group of people coming together to say this isn't right. And now we have platforms like social media where people who aren't in the same neighborhood can be pushing out the same message. We can organize community events together. We can have live stream events, so we can get the message out much more effectively than we could before. So I think just tapping into all of those things. There are other people who have had these experiences, and I think it takes advocates like Celeste sometimes to get everybody together. But saying, hey, I've dealt with this, I don't think that it's fair. Do you know anybody else who's going through this in my neighborhood, in my city? And can we organize a meeting? Because I think you're right, having things like tenant councils is really important.
Thank you. As housing prices continue to increase at a level disproportionate to the minimum wage, what obligations do landlords have with respect to keeping housing affordable and equitable, and what measures should local government take, if any? And maybe we could begin with Bill.
So you just mentioned wages. I think that's probably as important as anything. The wage growth, the stagnant wage growth that has caused people of modest means not to be able to keep up with this growth in the marketplace. The program, I think it's, you referred to tools in the toolbox. I think it's going to cost, everything's going to need to be deployed. Tax credits, housing opportunity fund to make this happen. One thing we're exploring right now, we just are putting the finishing touches on a 136 unit market rate development downtown at the corner of 8th Street and Penn Avenue. And we have a very friendly investor, Q Development, who's said, how can we make this development a model to other developers in the region? And he truly means that in his heart. And he said, what we're exploring right now is setting aside 10% units at affordable rates on our own accord with no regulatory reason to do that. And the hypothesis is, could this make the building better overall in the long run by not really relying on extremely high income folks or the steady stream of rising high income folks? Will it make the community better and the building more sustainable in the long run if there's more affordable opportunities within it? We're not all the way to the end of that, and I look forward to reporting back as we explore that, but I think it's going to take all hands on deck to to face this.
Short knowledge?
So I think, well, one, at the Housing Authority City of Pittsburgh, I mean, we are obligated to ensure that 75% of the applicants that we receive over a year are extremely low income. So that's 30% of the AMI or less. So that's our first priority. Secondly, I agree with Bill that it's going to take a real creative way, an innovative way, whether using tax credits, whether using 4%, 9%, you know, all the tools in the toolbox to really address these issues. We also have incentives for landlords, because at the end of the day, a landlord has to make the decision to choose a voucher. Like, there's no force there. So we're working on incentives, ways to incentivize landlords to want to become to take vouchers, and also I think changing the narrative around Section 8 and that program so that people have more opportunities. So yeah, those are the simple things I want to share.
I also want to touch on, in commemoration of the Fair Housing Act and to plug our event we're having next Wednesday with Andre Perry, is that the Brookings Institute published a study last fall, in that it established, and Pittsburgh included as a metropolitan area that was studied, that neighborhoods that are majority Black are devalued in a quantifiable way with the financial value of the homes, because of its demographics as being a majority Black neighborhood. And so in order to address home ownership, we have to address that historical and systemic discrimination that stemmed from the creation of the Holk maps and redlining and access to mortgages and the creation of communities in suburbs such as Levittown, which were white only, in that housing is the single most valuable way to transfer intergenerational wealth, and that we have to recognize the discrimination that happened that led to massive disparities in home ownership based on race. And part of the way to do that from a policy perspective that I've seen is that also pushed by the National Fair Housing Alliance, NAFA, in Washington, D.C., is to relook at how we establish and what we determine credit to be. And so if your credit worthiness also evaluates how often you pay your rent. Many of us have taken out credit cards and have other miscellaneous bills that have overextended ourselves due to a myriad of reasons, but do you pay your rent? And in reestablishing what credit looks like so as not to open ridiculous loans that led to the collapse in '08, but to establish home ownership in a meaningful way that values paying your rent in order to give home ownership to those of us who've been traditionally disenfranchised from the home ownership community and also disenfranchised by access to employment. We have to look at how we define providing those home loans.
Thank you. We're running a little tight on time, so I'm gonna combine the next two questions and then anyone can respond to them. Some argue that gentrification is inevitable, while others think its rise is preventable. Do you feel measures should be put in place to help mitigate the harmful aspects of it while still allowing for the economic revitalization of previously distressed regions? And for those communities that are in the process of gentrification, how can you help preserve their culture and identity?
So that's a really long question. I'm just going to answer part of that. So we've been talking a lot about tools in the toolbox, right? What are the strategies we can use? Housing Opportunity Fund has been talked about a lot. Something we haven't brought up is this idea of community land trusts, which, to speak to Megan's point, is a way for people who traditionally would not be able to become homeowners due to affordability issues. They get to become homeowners and still keep the price really low, and then when they are ready to sell, it still remains an affordable home. And I think that that's one of the things, you know, rising prices might be inevitable, but I think the harmful effects of gentrification are preventable. So as long as we aren't saying, okay, it's time for development, we're bringing Google in, it's time for everybody who has lived here for 100 years to leave, and all of these new people come in, if we're saying, how can we first make sure that we are able to keep people who want to stay in this neighborhood, make it affordable, give them a piece of the pie so that we have this area of opportunity and everybody gets choice in that. And I think that's the main thing. So thinking about things like how we can use the Housing Opportunity Fund, how we could use CLTs, community land trusts. We have them right now. Lawrenceville has one, Oakland has one. I know several other neighborhoods are looking at them. So really thinking outside the box, there is no one approach that is going to undo gentrification. And in neighborhoods like Homewood, where we can see it starting to happen, I think that's where we need to really hone in. You know, places like Lawrenceville and East Liberty, it has sort of already happened. There are still things that we can do to mitigate it, but I think we need to look to those next neighborhoods where it's starting and really get in there and put these tools in place.
Thank you. Anyone else? Bill? Celeste?
I'll just take a shot here. I'd say, can you prevent gentrification? No, I don't think it can be prevented. Can the harmful aspects be mitigated? Yes, I believe, and we've talked about many of the ways that can be done. And the second part of your question was, you know, how can communities preserve their culture and identity? I mean, simple answer is just first of all, know what your culture and identity is, be involved and be able to communicate that to the developers that come into your community. I believe Dan Rothschild from Rothschild Doino once said to be, communities get the developers they deserve. And I believe that's true in that if you have a widely accepted plan, identity, and an activated community base, you'll get a developer who's able to and willing to respond to that. If a community's disorganized, isn't quite sure who they are, who they want to be, you'll get a developer that reflects that identity. So I think I just encourage all communities to know what you want and have broad buy-in, and you'll get a developer to respond to that.
Ooh, this is a loaded question. A lot of answers. Gentrification, it might not be inevitable, but I think that we can fight it. Wow, this is a really heavy question. Especially for me, who has to see people every day suffering the effects of gentrification and the harm that comes along with it. I think that we have to fight gentrification and we have to reduce the harm, and that's for everybody. Even if you have to learn and become the developer in your community, I really believe in that. I also think that we have to stop building to attract people and remember the people that are here, that have fought all these years, 400 years or more to be in these places. And we have to remember that they deserve to live in a safe, quality, and affordable place. So preserving your culture and identity, if you have organized, you have to fight, you have to know the signs of gentrification. There are many. And there's just so many things stacked against, especially Black and brown people, that even when we fight, sometimes, you know, it doesn't seem like we're winning. But I think we just have to keep fighting, keep being creative, keep pushing for policies that are proactive, that dismantle these systems that have been structurally, racist, and just keep fighting. So I think that gentrification might be inevitable, but we can prevent it and we can fight it. And like I said, with the power of the people, we can do anything.
Thank you. Knowledge? Okay. We have two more questions, and then we're going to open it up to everyone here. Allegheny County has seen a large increase in people being incarcerated, disproportionately people of color. How can we assist people who struggle to find housing once they have served their time due to their criminal record? Knowledge and/or Ms. Hammond?
So we've been working on this for about over a year with some of our partners at the Housing Authority City of Pittsburgh and with DHS and other folks, just to try to identify, and also community residents, to find out from the residents' perspective how comfortable they are with ex-offenders in their communities, right? So the reality is that anyone can apply for housing and everyone has a right to housing, but there are some federal regulations that will prevent you to move into some of our housings. The reality is that you can appeal this, right, and do a grievance hearing. And so what we're working to let people know is that they have the right to appeal. And that's when the details come out, not just to check the box, but hey, I've been going to college, you know, I've been working for this amount of time, or whatever the details may be. So the key on that side is to educate people that they have a right to grievance hearing, so that in that situation is where you can be taken on a case-by-case basis. So, but we're still working to challenge these policies and even try to update our admin our admin policy so that we can engage people in the right manner or in a better manner.
I do want to comment on, especially when we discuss criminal history, that the current frontier of the Fair Housing Act is technology. And I'm sure you perhaps have seen in the news HUD's cause finding against Facebook as what technology has done when we reinvent what we already have is we also reinvent the historical biases that comes with it. And so technology is now reinventing racism. And I say that with criminal history because we're now seeing a number of cases in FIPS across the country where public and private landlords are using automated programs that just give a yes or no to who someone is based on creditworthiness and criminal history. And when we recognize historic disenfranchisement to credit access and the racist nature of our criminal justice system that disproportionately locks up our Black and brown and disabled population, and that I always plug it. It's a book that's close to my heart to see housing get into the mainstream, but is Matt Desmond's eviction book, where he says that Black men are locked up and Black women are locked out by disproportionate eviction rates. And I've always remembered that phrase. And so when landlords don't consider criminal history, particularly based on the individual and the circumstances, we are locking so many of us out and maintaining the status quo of white-only neighborhoods, especially in areas of privilege. So especially to our private landlords, and those of us who are here already know that's how you got on the invitation list as we discuss this, and you're down for the cause, is that looking at criminal history as who the person is and what happened, instead of blanket automated policies that come back with a faceless decision from technology that then required a fair housing complaint to address because everything gets put back on, well, that's what the computer said. But the computer was made by people. So it's what people said, not the computer.
Thank you. Last question. Black homeownership rates have stagnated since the 2008 financial crash, and Black people still struggle to get access to credit. What city policies or programs should Pittsburgh focus on that can create more opportunities for Black families to reach homeownership?
So the Housing Authority, City of Pittsburgh, we have a homeownership program in which we work with the Urban League and other partners to help educate residents as well as people who are housing choice vouchers or people who are just residents of Pittsburgh on how to clean up your credit. Well, we don't do that. Our partners do, how to clean up their credit and how to get access to housing, and then we will provide them opportunity to be able to own a home. So I won't go into all the details because it's on our website, which is, well, I won't plug the website, but last year we were, go ahead, it's hacp.org. But last year we were able to help 21 families get homes, first-time home buyers. This year our goal is to up that to 30, and then next year is to do 50. So we're providing a soft second mortgage that will eventually go away after in that home of about 10 years. So like I said, the details are online, but that's how we're trying to help solve that problem, not just for Black people, just people in Pittsburgh.
I should not have let you go because you stole what I was going to say. So I'm one of those partners who talks at those homeowner workshops. So I think it's the third Saturday of every month at Urban League. There's the Section 8 homeowners workshop. And I found that to be really powerful. I have learned a lot just by sitting there, things that I didn't know about homeownership and the things that you need to do. And watching people learn how financially empowering it can be in a way that they can stay in their communities and build assets and things that people maybe just didn't know before. So while I'm somebody who's giving information at those, it's also been really educational for me. Again, I think programs like the different community land trusts are ways to increase home ownership rates. That's for everybody, not just typically Black renters. I think also, the Housing Opportunity Fund has the Home Buyers Program and different programs that they're going to be rolling out. So again, I think you're not just looking for one answer to this. It is a lot of different tools that we're making sure people know about, not just somebody who has signed up for a workshop. I think we need to really have a campaign to get the information out to everybody across Pittsburgh. I know the Housing Opportunity Fund has had some billboards, and I think things like that, you wouldn't think about it, but I see it on my way to work every single day. I see URA's billboard that says like, hey, you know, do you need emergency assistance for this? And that's a great way for people to get to know about these programs that haven't been personally invited. So I think continuing things like that in social media as well.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Megan and Knowledge said. And I also like to challenge the idea of ownership as not just home ownership, but land ownership. The people that have the land have the power, so I would hope that we have programs that, and I would be remiss with Ms. Carroll in the audience not to talk about tenant cooperatives and tenant ownership. So just thinking about ownership in some really creative and radical ways and creating the policies that bolster that.
And to return to it, not to sound like a broken record, I simply would always emphasize as Fair Housing Month to make sure to make particular attention, as many of these programs already do, to address the historically disenfranchised. And I bring this up only to say to, once again, talk about my mother. She would be so embarrassed. But she, 10 years after living in public housing, she became a homeowner. And she became a homeowner through the deaf community, where Washington, D.C. and Maryland and the tri-state area have a very big and supportive deaf community. And so it was people who literally spoke her language and who understood her culturally that were able to relate to her to give her the information she needed. Specifically, is that we went to church every Sunday, and the interpreters were volunteer interpreters. One of her interpreters was her English professor at Gallaudet, and us kids would always play a game as we got bored in church about if we could make the interpreter laugh by signing jokes to them while the priest was being very, very serious. And so, but what that interpreter did was, she was also a real estate agent. And so it was the deaf community that provided access in a language and culture that a disenfranchised community could understand and could access. Because let's recognize that when 2008 happened and the collapse in the housing market happened, it was proven that Wells Fargo had a drop-down menu when it said languages. In their drop-down language and the predatory nature of their loans, it said ghetto. So it has been used against us to make us take predatory loans out that lost our homes, and now we need to find ways to use it for us in order to give us access now.
Thank you, and thank you all. It's now, we have a couple minutes left. If there are any questions from the public? Sorry?
Can you repeat the questions?
Yes.
I don't have a question, I have a comment. And I mean, everyone on the panel spoke really well, a lot of good pointers, but I see HUD's here and I just want to put it in front of y'all. A lot of one tool that is important and is missing in the toolbox is the real income measurement. A lot of this is based off of AMI. AMI doesn't adjust for inflation. So people would be better off if they do have an opportunity to pay 30% of their income, but they're never becoming better off because inflation is growing over here. So I just want to put that out there because it puzzled me, and we were working on the affirmatively furthering fair housing. I kept putting it out there in the atmosphere, but no one would listen to me. So finally we got in front of the students. They're like, oh, Ms. Curl, she knows what she's talking about, but she's calling it wrong. It's called real income. And then, you know, that really makes a big difference in people's lives because no matter where we think and how we think home ownership or renters, if people never have it's given the opportunity to become better off in their life, then, you know, all this work is just done for nothing. Thank you.
Thank you. We had another one down front here.
Hello, everyone. It was so beneficial to hear you speak what I've been saying for the last 40 years. I started off being a delegate for my community when I was in pigtails. Now all my ancestors has gone to heaven, so now I'm here fighting for low-income housing. The one thing what y'all forgot, you forgot me. You can't make a decision for me. You can't tell me how much I have to pay. Please put us on your board, HUD. Hear us about what's going on with these private managements. They're doing us wrong. They're smacking us in the face and still telling us to pay our rent. I had to come out into my society and get my councilman and my representative and my Hill House could come and help me fight because they wouldn't hear me. They wouldn't even speak to me. All they said, I want your rent. Well, now I'm telling them, you're not going to keep doing this to me. HUD, they've been lying to you. They've been taking advantage of us. I've been living in a deplorable place where I had to go beg the city to cover up the manhole because if one of the kids' ball was to go in that manhole, that kid would have went down that manhole too. And that place was like that before I got there. So therefore, that lets you know what we're going through. Everything that everyone spoke of, except for your developers, I want to be on your board when you come to develop something. Don't tell me about that mass floor because it's shiny and pretty. Tell me about what's made of that floor, because my baby got to crawl on that floor. My grandmother got to sit in that chair. They got to inhale all of those fumes. So please put me on your boards. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Are we at the end, Jay?
Ron Saunders, I'm president of the Dr. Edna B. McKenzie Chapter Association for the Study of African American Life and History. First of all, I'd like to give props to our Daniel Lavelle. His grandfather is the one who stood up and filed a federal lawsuit that made it possible for African Americans to have access to the multi-list. So let's give him a big round of applause. His grandfather. Second of all, I don't know, in terms of gentrification, or whether or not we presently require, and this is something, Daniel, you can answer, perhaps the city, adverse impact studies. Any contract that goes out to a developer should have an adverse impact study in that. That has to be a given. That City Council should be working in cooperation with the City Human Relations Commission. Nothing should be going out of City Hall, and city planning has to be on board with that if that's not occurring. Second of all, thirdly, I like to say you need to have an aggressive, relentless, in a partnership with the City Commission, Fair Housing Partnership, to work aggressively in a high prevention program and the state, doing community outreach and educating citizens, realtors, landlords, developers. Prevention, that's one thing, prevention, education, but also in the context with your mission, you have to maybe do peer housing testing. That's another facet of it. They do this all around the country. Then to develop a test where you can use paired housing testing in home loan mortgages. I don't know whether that's being actually practiced in this country, but you have paired housing testing because typically many African Americans and disabled people still live in apartments. We need to do that. We did that when I was with the commission many years ago. We found that 99.9% of all the respondents in the greater Pittsburgh area discriminated against our pepper tester, who was the African American tester. I don't know whether that's significantly changed that much in the last 35 years. Education, prevention with realtors, landlords, community people. Most people who are lay people, they don't know what disparate treatment is in the context of fair housing. We have to go out in the community, do the outreach, work in consultation with this young man here and with young lady from the City Commission, Megan, working together. That's what we have to do. You have to be aggressive, know what your mission is, and go after it. You can prevent it, but on the same hand, you folks that work in enforcement understand that you have the law behind you. I hear a lot of things in this conversation about exclusionary zoning laws. Well, the city cannot be complicit, or the state, in any complicit activity. You cannot be complicit. So anything that goes past that desk, the city commission, or the powers that be should review any contract. I just want to make that clear, because I can talk on. I love to talk, but anyway, I'll refer. Thank you.
You want to respond? Okay, so real quick, and if you could bring Megan the mic so she can respond. I'm not sure if what you're calling an adverse impact statement is exactly what I was working on, but maybe about 2 years ago, I was working on a bill that was called a housing impact statement that would look at, when we're approving housing deals, what is that going to do to the surrounding communities? What is that going to do to AMI and all these other sort of factors? If that's similar, now ultimately, the planning department at the time had some concerns with some of the language we had in there. Ultimately, that bill died. We're actually reworking on that bill now, and we hope to have that reintroduced in the coming month or so. So that is something we are working on.
I will also say the thing, and you know this, Ron, the thing that makes my job the hardest in the commission in general is that we don't have the rental registry, so we don't know who landlords are. Anybody can become a landlord by owning property. I'm going to say that Knowledge, who has some property and is thinking about renting, came to me and said, "Can you talk to me about my responsibilities as a landlord?" That's not a common thing that we have happen. I loved that it happened. I want to be able to talk to all landlords, because a lot of times I think that there are some people who do mean to discriminate, but there are some people who do something, they don't know that it's necessarily discriminatory or that it's unlawful, and they don't know until a complaint comes to us, then we're taking an enforcement action, then they're paying a fair bit of money in a settlement agreement, or there's a cause finding and we have to go to a public hearing. Those aren't outcomes that I like. I would rather know who all the landlords in Pittsburgh are, so I can sit them down and say, these are your obligations. Come to me with questions. That's the ideal interaction. But without having that registry, it's really hard to know. I will say that there are landlords that we've worked with where we've had a complaint, we have a cause finding, they end up going to an agreement, and later they will call us and say, hey, this just happened, can you tell us if this is right or wrong? Can you tell us what the law is? And I like to see that. So I think landlords do want to know, we just don't know who all of them are, and it's very hard to get to them.
Real quick. We work with the Pennsylvania for Northern Courts. We've been working with them, with the magistrates, the tenants, the landlords, and the magistrates. And they have a great handbook. Yes.
Thank you. If there are no other burning questions, I'm going to ask this gentleman to be the last question.
Get your steps in.
My name is Tariq Williams. I'm a resident of South Oakland. I hear a lot of emphasis on outreach, on education, on we're going to go into these communities and we're going to find out what they need and we're going to do all these things. I also am experiencing a problem in a lot of rooms with representation. So these organizations that do these things across the city of Pittsburgh, which is a very segregated city, are also very white organizations. So we're talking about communities that are Black and brown populations that are receiving the blunt impact of these assaults. And I hear white people talking about, well, we're gonna mobilize and go into these communities and fix this. And it's like, that is not what has happened historically in these communities, and that's not what I logically think should be happening as we move forward into the future. So I have a problem with being as young as I am here, and I don't necessarily see a lot of people that are my age here. So I could think that people my age don't want to be here, or I could think people y'all age don't want people my age here. And that's a problem. So I really would like to see, I need to see an emphasis on these older people, these leaders of these communities and these organizations really doing the work that we're saying we're going to do and in an authentic and legitimate way. So I don't want to see Megan Stanley in Black and brown communities trying to talk to people about things that she doesn't understand. I would like to see us reaching out to folks from these communities, paying them, because I feel like the youngest people here are all getting paid to be here, and I think that's a problem. And really utilizing the community resources that exist in these communities to really cause an effective change in our communities, and not just talk about it. Let's dance.
Thank you.
I agree with, these are all my comrades, the people that I work with and learn from daily. I think I would be remiss not to bring up what's happening. I think you guys went on a tour of Glen Hazel. HUD went on a tour. So what's happening up in Glen Hazel, and you know, people just really knowing what a red conversion is. I had to read up on it, and I'm from Broadhead Manor, and I'm from these places, and people, you know, transparency, accountability, people knowing, and I know Jay had been talking to a lot of people about what your rights are, what reasonable accommodations mean. People are like running up, leaving, not even knowing that they have a right to stay and a right to organize. So I just think that's really important to really raise up as well in this room. And so I hope that people do, like Tyreek said, get outside these walls and get out into the communities and really continue to fight and to make sure that folks are not being harmed. That is the ultimate goal here.
I also just want, I think it's really important, I agree, to mobilize, to educate, organize. And I just want to say that at the Housing Authority, we have the FSS department and team that works with the tenant council presidents who then work with the residents. So the goal is to like train the leaders in the community and teach them how to teach the communities, you know? So it's sometimes a trickle down effect, but it's like, it's a continual process, and this is something that has to be ongoing. You can't just do one presentation and expect this, like, you know, banking theory model that you told someone so they get it. It has to be continual. So we have monthly meetings educating tenant council presidents, fielding their policy problems and issues that they have, and solving these issues, right? So that we can really be a part of the solution and not have a top-down approach, just identifying the problems.
I just want to touch on both comments real quick as we finish up here. Last fall, when the Oscars came out, I was speaking with my friends and family about the identity movies, right? And the Green Book won the Oscar. But the Green Book makes us all feel, or you know, white people feel comfortable with historic racism and that we're past it. But the better movie, in my personal opinion, was Spike Lee's The Black Klansman, an amazing movie. And what enforcement does, and to touch on what testing does, as we train volunteers to go out and to ask about available properties, testing is the Black Klansman, where it holds a mirror up that makes us confront the reality of who we are and how we're a part of the system itself. And I bring that up in this context to explain that I am extraordinarily proud, while I recognize it is a drop in a very, very big ocean, that with the city commission that we recently settled, a race-based testing case, where it was testing that proved time and time again that a local private landlord denied Black men. She charged Black women more money, inquired about young Black men. She denied older Black men, but inquired into younger Black men's credit score with much more depth and ferocity in the questions than with young white men. And so it was testing when a community group came to us and said, we called up a local landlord, we said we have a housing subsidy program, will you take our subsidy? And the landlord's response was, what's the race of your program participants? And it was testing that followed through with the enforcement of the act to hold that mirror up that forced all of us. And as landlords, we put in a position of power of maintaining and being in control of people's housing. And that it's testing and that we're there to do even better with it, to hold those individuals that do participate in discrimination accountable for those actions.
Hi, with HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. So I appreciate Jay for pulling this panel together. lots of comments that were very valuable. The whole notion of gentrification, partnership, community building, et cetera. It matters that this becomes memorialized, right? How many of you have read the city's consolidated plan? Everyone in this room should have read that plan, right? So the notion that there's a consolidated plan that should connect the dots between everything you voiced. Ms. Carroll, you stood up and you talked about affirmatively furthering fair housing, right? The city receives funds to ensure that those efforts are made. And so planning, development, design, all happens around the city's planning process. There's a citizen's participation function of that plan. So your comments, the things that you've said about mobilizing, exclusionary, inclusionary zoning, those become a part of what the city can do. It becomes documented. It becomes accounted for. We talked to a couple of folks in the room who are working on the city's analysis of impediments, right? That's a document that creates all the issues, the fair housing issues in a community, and the city is responsible for ameliorating or decreasing those impediments, and they're responsible for creating measurable actions and outcomes. So what you want to see happen in your community should be memorialized in that document. So if no one in the room has seen a consolidated plan, I encourage you to go to your city's website because it should be there. And if it's not, you can actually go to their office and request a copy of the plan. You should read it because it plans out for 5 years exactly what the city is going to do and how things are going to happen in your communities. It also gives you the opportunity to look at those things that if inclusionary zoning is not included and it's something that you want to see, then you petition the city to do that because they work directly with your city councils, right? Your city councils are who run your community. So when they can own and participate in that process and hear what your voices are saying, it gets put behind that document. That document is what you hold as your Bible, your book for the 5-year planning process. It makes sure and you make certain that those things are happening. So again, if you haven't seen the city's consolidated plan, you should. The Housing Authority should be working in tandem with the city about where they place property and how properties are placed. It's a very important document that I think everyone in the room should participate in terms of citizens' participation, right? Having your voice heard and then having your comments memorialized. It holds the city accountable for thinking about your issue of AMI. The city can redefine that. They can look at ways in which that can be incorporated in certain types of planning and housing. So I offer that as a resource and as an action item for everyone in this room to be challenged to go to the website, pull that document up, look at it, and figure out how you become a part of that planning process.
Jay, we have one. Jay, can we take one last question?
I'm just trying to say, I gotta say, as a person who for probably 30 years has tried to play the citizen participation game in the con plan, there is no right time to be a citizen trying to participate in that plan. When you have an opportunity to comment, how many plans has HUD disapproved because the citizen participation showed that the citizens didn't approve or support the plan? Because what I find is when I go to the public hearings, the plan's already written, and there's no time to change that plan by when it's due, and that the comments don't mean that the next plan is changed, and the plan looks the same. And I would say that if you have a pot of $15 million coming into the city of Pittsburgh on a yearly basis where you have almost no participation from the citizenry, it's because they've learned a lesson that it's useless. And so I really challenge the whole citizen participation smoke screen, because I don't see that citizens have a meaningful input even when they try.
Well, I'm going to say one thing before I kind of dump it back, if you don't mind, and just grab the mic for a second. To Paul's point, one of the things that I think has taken place with us is we have all kind of commented individually on kind of small comments and not really unified as a community to make the comments. And I do understand your frustration. We've had similar frustration. But I think we are in a unique position and a unique time here in Pittsburgh where our city is about to undergo, it's already started undergoing a rapid change. And as a result, when we look at, we also happen to be falling into a timeline of the con plan, right? And so the real question becomes, to Melody's point from HUD, if we all read it through, and we all have a different lens, whether we are community members who are living in the space, whether we are fair housing advocates who are fighting for the space, whether we are commission members who are trying to enforce the space, if we have and read and see the same thing and make those comments over to HUD, then we also have the ability to jointly come back to HUD and say, so what are we doing about it? If we don't, then you are right, Paul. Then what happens is we make a comment, and I want to make one other kind of side note before I go forward. Our HUD folks, right? I mean, honestly, I've spent a very long time ripping on HUD for a good chunk of my career. We've got really good HUD folks right now, and they've been around. They are really fighting for us. So if we provide them with the kind of unity and statement to them, it gives them the ammunition they need to kind of bring that to the next level. When it's just my comment over here about one thing, and Paul, your comment over there about another thing, and your comment about another thing, and it's not a unified statement, then it's just individual one has one problem, individual two, and we don't get the kind of results that I think could frustrate us. So I would simply say, we need to do the job of figuring out how we're going to comment jointly and bring it together as a community, so that as the development goes forward in our community, we actually have a voice. I'll set it back to you all.
Good. So at this point, I want to thank all the panelists for participating. Definitely thank you all for participating. I would like to bring Ms. Stanley back up so she can give some closing remarks.
Well, not really much more to say. I just want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank our partners at HUD for coming all this way. I want to thank Fair Housing Partnership for helping us put this event together, and our sponsors at the Housing Authority of the City of Pittsburgh. I think that what we learned from this is we've done a lot towards fair housing, but we have a lot of work to do, as Jay said earlier. So I want us to all come together and keep fighting for this, as we just did with House Bill 71, which got shut down because the community came together. We made a unified statement that we didn't want it to pass, and it didn't go anywhere. So I think that's the same thing that Jay was saying. We need to make unified statements about what we want to change. Just as a reminder, we have our event next Wednesday on the 24th with Dr. Andre Perry. The flyers are out on the table. We hope all of you can come at the Kelly Strayhorn Theater. Thank you.